The rain fell like bullets on the muddy floor of Trench 77 Alpha, each drop carrying the metallic taste of death that had soaked into the soil of Mourntide V for the past 18 months. Trooper Rhen pressed his back against the corrugated metal wall, feeling the cold seep through his flak armor like icy fingers reaching for his spine. "Another sleepless night in paradise," he muttered, adjusting his grip on his standard-issue las gun. The weapon felt heavier than usual, or maybe it was just the weight of fear pressing down on his shoulders. The trench stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into a fog that never seemed to lift. Industrial towers loomed in the distance like the skeletal remains of some ancient beast, their twisted metal frames barely visible through the perpetual mist. This was supposed to be a simple holding action against the orc hordes, but 3 weeks into their deployment, Rhen was beginning to suspect that the greenskins were the least of their worries. "Rhen!" The sharp whisper came from his left, where Guardsman Torres was hunched over his voxcaster, frantically adjusting dials. "You hear that?" Rhen strained his ears, filtering out the constant patter of rain and the distant rumble of artillery. At first, there was nothing. Then, barely audible beneath the ambient noise of war, he heard it. A whisper. Not words exactly, but something that felt like language, like meaning trying to claw its way into his consciousness. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, rising from the mud itself. "That's just the wind," Rhen said, but his voice cracked slightly. "Or maybe interference on the Vox." Torres shook his head, his eyes wide with an emotion that went beyond simple fear. "No, man. I've been hearing it for 3 nights now. It's saying things." "What kind of things?" "Names. It knows our names, Rhen. Last night, it whispered mine for 20 minutes straight." A chill ran down Ren's spine that had nothing to do with the cold rain. He was about to respond when Sergeant Kale's voice cut through the fog from somewhere deeper in the trench. "All right, you sorry excuses for soldiers. Gather round for evening briefing." Rhen shouldered his las gun and made his way through the narrow passage, stepping carefully over coils of razor wire and empty ration cans. The trench was a maze of interconnected tunnels and defensive positions, dug deep into the earth like the burrows of some massive creature. Every few meters, alcoves had been carved into the walls to provide sleeping quarters, though Rhen doubted anyone had gotten much rest lately. The briefing area was a slightly wider section of trench where a dozen guardsmen could gather around a flickering glow globe. Sergeant Kale stood at the center, his weathered face illuminated by the pale light. At 35, he was ancient by Imperial Guard standards, his survival a testament to both skill and luck. But lately, Rhen had noticed new lines around the sergeant's eyes and a nervous tick that made his left hand twitch toward his sidearm. "Listen up," Kale began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had seen too much and lived to tell about it. "Command says the orc advance has stalled about 15 kilometers east of our position. They're regrouping for another push, which means we might actually get some sleep tonight." A few of the guardsmen chuckled, but the sound was hollow, forced. Everyone knew that sleep was becoming increasingly difficult in the trenches. "Any word on reinforcements, Sarge?" asked Corporal Drex, a stocky man from the hive world of Necromunda. His face bore the pale scars typical of underhive dwellers, but even he looked unsettled. "Negative. We hold this position until further orders." Kale's eyes swept over the assembled soldiers. "Speaking of which, we've had some irregularities in our patrol reports. Guardsmen going missing during night watch, strange sounds, that sort of thing." The group fell silent. Everyone had heard the stories, but hearing Kale acknowledge them officially made them feel more real, more threatening. "I want to remind everyone that fatigue and stress can play tricks on the mind," Kale continued. "But I also want double watches on all positions. Nobody goes anywhere alone, and if you see anything unusual, anything at all, you report it immediately." "What about the whispers, Sergeant?" The question came from Medic Tova, a slight woman with prematurely gray hair who spoke rarely but always with purpose. Kale's jaw tightened. "What whispers?" "Half the regiment is hearing them. Voices in the fog, calling their names, saying things that—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Things that no one should know." The sergeant was quiet for a long moment, his hand unconsciously moving to the grip of his lost pistol. "Like I said, stress can play tricks on the mind. But if anyone feels like they're losing their grip, they come to me immediately. We've seen what happens to soldiers who crack under pressure, and we can't afford to have compromised personnel in the line." Rhen thought about Torres and his 3 nights of whispered names. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. Something in Kale's tone suggested that reporting the whispers might not be in Torres's best interest. "Dismissed," Kale said. "Get some rest while you can." As the guardsmen dispersed back to their positions, Rhen noticed Tova lingering near the glow globe. She was clutching something against her chest, partially hidden beneath her medical kit. Medic? Rhen approached her cautiously. Tova looked up, startled. Trooper, how are you feeling? Any symptoms of trench rot, respiratory issues, psychological stress? I'm fine, Rhen lied. What's that you're holding? Tova's grip tightened on the object. Something I found during yesterday's patrol. A book? A book? Out here. It was in one of the abandoned positions about half a kilometer north. Someone left it behind when they retreated. Rhen squinted at the object in her hands. It looked old, bound in what might have been leather, though the material had a strange, oily quality that seemed to shift in the globe's light. What kind of book? He asked. I'm not sure yet. The writing is unusual, but I think it might contain information about this place, about what's been happening to our men. A cold wind suddenly whipped through the trench, extinguishing the globe and plunging them into darkness. In the sudden silence that followed, Rhen heard it again. The whisper. This time it was clearer, more distinct. And it was saying his name. Rhen. Rhen, come to us, Rhen. The voice seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the mud and the metal and the very air around them. It was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist. Did you hear that? He whispered to Tova, but when he turned, she was gone. He was alone in the darkness, with only the whispers for company. Rhen, we know you. Rhen, we know your fears. His hands shook as he fumbled for his lamp pack, the small device that would provide enough light to navigate the trench. The whispers grew louder as he worked, more insistent. You dream of home, Rhen. You dream of your sister, but she's dead, isn't she? Dead because you left her behind. Shut up, Rhen growled, finally managing to activate the lamp. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty trench around him. She called for you when the Hivegangers came, called your name just like we're calling it now. Shut up, Rhen shouted, his voice echoing off the metal walls. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of rain and his own ragged breathing. But in the sudden silence, he heard something else. Footsteps splashing through the muddy water at the bottom of the trench. Someone was coming. Rhen? You all right? It was Torres, his friend's voice tight with concern. Yeah, Rhen called back, surprised by how normal his voice sounded. Just thought I heard something. Torres appeared in the lamp's beam, his own weapon drawn. The whispers. Rhen nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They're getting worse, Torres said. More frequent, more personal. What do you think they are? Torres was quiet for a moment, looking around the trench as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. My grandmother back on Cadia used to tell stories about the old wars, about places where the veil between reality and the warp grew thin. She said that battlefields, places where lots of people died in fear and pain, sometimes became infected. Infected with what? With the echoes of all that death and suffering. She called them hungry ghosts, spirits that fed on fear and despair. Rhen felt his blood turn to ice. You think that's what's happening here? I think this whole planet is one big graveyard and something is waking up underneath our feet. As if in response to his words, the whispers began again, but this time they were different. Instead of calling names, they were laughing. A sound like wind through broken glass, filled with malice and terrible joy. And somewhere in the distance, a scream cut through the night. Brief, agonized, and then suddenly silent. Another guardsman had disappeared. The morning brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over Trench 77 Alpha. If anything, the daylight made things worse, revealing the fresh bloodstains that had appeared overnight near position Charlie 4. Corporal Drex was gone, vanished without a trace except for his lost gun lying in the mud and a message scrawled on the trench wall in what looked suspiciously like blood. Listen, the message read in crude, angular letters. Listen and despair. Rhen stared at the words, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the perpetual dampness of the trenches. Beside him, Sergeant Cale examined the scene with the methodical attention of a man who had investigated too many similar disappearances. No signs of struggle, Cale muttered, crouching beside Drex's abandoned weapon. No shell casings, no blast marks. It's like he just walked away. People don't just walk away from their posts, said Guardsman Elric, a tall, lean man whose devotion to the Emperor was as obvious as the Aquila tattooed on his forehead. Especially not Drex. He was solid. Rhen nodded in agreement. Drex had been one of the most reliable soldiers in their squad, a veteran of 3 campaigns who could sleep through artillery bombardments and wake up instantly at the first sign of real danger. The idea that he would abandon his post was absurd. Maybe he was taken, Rhen suggested. By what? Cale stood up, his knees popping audibly. The orcs are still 15 kilometers away and there's no evidence of infiltrators. What about the whispers? The sergeant's face darkened. The whispers are stress-induced auditory hallucinations. They don't drag people out of trenches. Then where is he? Cale had no answer for that. Instead, he turned to address the small crowd of guardsmen who had gathered to stare at the bloody message. All right, show's over. We've got a job to do, and standing around gawking isn't going to bring Drex back. The soldiers dispersed reluctantly, but Rhen noticed that several of them kept glancing back at the wall as if expecting the message to change or multiply. As he turned to leave, a hand touched his shoulder. He spun around to find Medic Tova standing behind him, her gray eyes intense with some inner urgency. "Trooper Rhen," she said in a low voice. "I need to show you something." She led him away from the main trench to a smaller auxiliary passage that was rarely used except during heavy bombardments. Here, sheltered from prying eyes, she pulled out the book she had been carrying the night before. In the gray daylight filtering through the fog, Rhen could see it more clearly. The binding was definitely leather, but it had an unnatural texture, as if it were made from skin that had never belonged to any recognizable animal. Strange symbols were carved into the cover, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when he looked at them directly. "I've been reading it," Tova said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or trying to. Most of it is written in languages I don't recognize, but there are some passages in Low Gothic." "What does it say?" Tova opened the book carefully, as if handling a live grenade. The pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in dense text written in multiple hands. Some sections were illuminated with grotesque illustrations that made Ren's stomach turn. "It's a journal," she said, "written by soldiers who were stationed here before us. Some of the entries go back decades." She flipped to a page marked with a strip of cloth. "Listen to this. Day 43 of the siege. The whispers have grown stronger. Last night, they spoke to Private Kellern, telling him things about his family that no one could know. He says they promised to reunite him with his dead wife if he would just walk into the fog. We found his body this morning, or what was left of it. The medic says it looks like he was torn apart from the inside out." Rhen felt his mouth go dry. "When was this written?" "The date stamp says 9/37/M41. That's over 60 years ago. But that's impossible. This position has only been active for 18 months. Tova shook her head grimly. "That's what I thought too. But look at this." She turned to another page, this one marked with what looked like a map of the trench system. But the layout was wrong, showing passages and chambers that didn't exist in their current position. "The trenches are older than we thought," she said. "Much older. This book contains accounts from at least a dozen different regiments, all stationed in the same area, all reporting the same phenomena. The whispers, among other things." She flipped to another page, this one filled with crude drawings of shadowy figures with glowing red eyes. "They call them the Watchers. Entities that feed on fear and despair, growing stronger with each soul they claim." Rhen studied the drawings, noting the way the artist had tried to capture something that seemed to exist partly in shadow and partly in nightmare. What happened to all those regiments? They disappeared. All of them. Official records show them as lost to enemy action, but the truth is in here. She tapped the book. They were consumed one by one until nothing was left but empty trenches and the hungry dead. A sound from the main passage made them both freeze. Footsteps approaching slowly and deliberately. Tova quickly closed the book and hid it beneath her medical kit just as Torres appeared around the corner. "There you are," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Sergeant Cale wants everyone to report to the command post. We're getting new orders." As they made their way back to the main trench, Rhen couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Not by Torres or the other guardsmen, but by something else. Something that lurked in the shadows between the metal walls and fed on the growing terror that was spreading through their ranks like a plague. The command post was a reinforced dugout carved into the side of the trench, barely large enough to hold a dozen men. Sergeant Cale stood at the center, illuminated by the harsh light of a portable illuminator. His face looked haggard, aged beyond his years by the strain of command in an impossible situation. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I've just received word from command. The Orc advance has resumed and they're expected to reach our position within 48 hours. A murmur of unease rippled through the assembled soldiers. They had been hoping for evacuation, for transfer to a more secure position. Instead, they were being asked to hold their ground against an enemy that outnumbered them 10-1. "Sir," Elric spoke up, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "What about the irregularities we've been experiencing? The missing personnel?" Cale's jaw tightened. "Command is aware of our situation. They've classified our reports as stress-related incidents and recommended that we maintain discipline and faith in the Emperor." "That's it?" Torres asked incredulously. Men are disappearing and their solution is to pray harder. That's enough, Kale snapped. We are soldiers of the Imperial Guard. We follow orders even when those orders seem impossible. Especially then. He looked around the dugout, meeting each man's eyes in turn. I won't lie to you. Our situation is difficult, but we have our duty and we will perform it to the best of our ability. The Emperor protects, but he also expects us to protect ourselves. What are our orders, Sergeant? Rhen asked. We are to establish a forward observation post in the ruins of Hab Block 7 about 2 kilometers north of our current position. Intelligence reports suggest the orcs will use it as a staging area for their assault. The blood drained from Rhen's face. Hab Block 7 was in the direction of the abandoned trenches where Tova had found the book. It was also where several of their missing comrades had been assigned before they disappeared. Sir, he said carefully, that area has been problematic. I'm aware of that, Trooper. Which is why I'm sending our best people. Kale's eyes swept over the group. Rhen, Torres, Elric, and Medic Tova will establish the observation post and maintain contact with base. The rest of us will prepare the main position for the orc assault. Rhen wanted to object, to point out that sending a 4-man team into the area where so many others had vanished was tantamount to murder. But military discipline held his tongue. In the Imperial Guard, orders were orders even when they were death sentences. We move out at 0600 hours, Kale continued. Any questions? There were none, or at least none that anyone dared to voice. As the briefing broke up, Rhen found himself walking beside Tova toward their assigned sleeping area. The medic looked pale and drawn, clutching her kit with white-knuckled intensity. You brought the book, he said quietly. She nodded. I think we're going to need it. If what I've read is true, Hab Block 7 is the epicenter of whatever is happening here. The place where it all began. What began? The feeding, the corruption, the slow transformation of this world into something that exists as much in the warp as in reality. They reached Rhen's sleeping alcove, a narrow space carved into the trench wall and covered with a tarp for privacy. Inside, his sleeping bag and personal effects looked pitifully small and vulnerable. There's something else, Tova said, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. The book contains a ritual, a way to communicate with the Watchers directly. Rhen stared at her in horror. Please tell me you're not thinking of trying it. I'm thinking that if we're going to die out there, we might as well understand what's killing us first. Before Rhen could respond, a new sound echoed through the trenches. Not whispers this time, but something else. Something like singing, if singing could be done with voices that had been torn apart by madness and despair. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, rising from the mud and metal and fog like a hymn to some dark god. And as it grew louder, Rhen realized with growing horror that he recognized the melody. It was a lullaby his sister used to sing when they were children, back on their homeworld before the Hivegangers came and destroyed everything he had ever loved. The voices in the dark knew his past, his pain, his deepest fears, and they were using that knowledge against him, trying to break down his defenses one memory at a time. Tomorrow they would venture into the heart of the nightmare. Tonight, he could only listen to the corrupted echoes of his childhood and pray that dawn would come quickly. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a terrible thought was taking root. What if dawn never came? What if they were already dead? Already claimed by the hungry shadows that lurked beneath Mourntide V. What if the whispers weren't trying to drive them mad? What if they were trying to wake them up? The pre-dawn darkness was absolute as the 4-man team prepared to leave the relative safety of Trench 77 Alpha. Rhen checked his equipment one final time. Lost gun, power cells, frag grenades, water purification tablets, and rations for 3 days. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. Beside him, Torres was performing the same ritual, his movements mechanical and precise. The whispers had kept him awake for the past week, and it showed in the dark circles under his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands. Remember, Sergeant Kale said, addressing the team one final time, your primary objective is reconnaissance. Establish the observation post, monitor orc movement, and report back every 6 hours. Do not engage the enemy unless absolutely necessary. What about the other problems? Elric asked, his hand unconsciously moving to the Aquila pendant hanging from his neck. Kale's expression darkened. Maintain unit cohesion. Watch each other's backs. And if anyone shows signs of mental instability, the team leader has authorization to take appropriate action. The unspoken implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. If anyone started succumbing to the whispers, they would be considered compromised and dealt with accordingly. Medic Tova adjusted her kit, making sure the forbidden book was securely hidden among her medical supplies. How do we contact you if we run into serious trouble? Long-range Vox every 6 hours. Emergency channel if needed. But remember, we're expecting Orc advance scouts in the area. Radio silence unless absolutely necessary. Rhen nodded, though he suspected that Orcs would be the least of their problems where they were going. The team moved out through a concealed exit in the northern section of the trench, emerging into the pre-dawn gloom like ghosts leaving their graves. The landscape before them was a twisted maze of shell craters, rusted metal debris, and the skeletal remains of industrial machinery. In the distance, the dark bulk of Hab Block 7 loomed against the gray sky like a diseased tooth. They moved in standard formation. Elric on point, Rhen and Torres flanking, Tova bringing up the rear. The ground beneath their feet was soft and treacherous, a mixture of mud, ash, and things that might once have been organic matter. Every step produced a wet, sucking sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. As they advanced, Rhen became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere. The air felt thicker, more oppressive, as if it were saturated with invisible moisture. His skin began to crawl with the sensation of being watched, though he could see nothing but empty wasteland in every direction. Anyone else feeling this? Torres whispered, his voice barely audible through the vox bead in Rhen's ear. Feeling what? Elric's reply was terse, professional. Like we're walking through a graveyard at midnight. Maintain radio discipline, Rhen reminded them. Though he knew exactly what Torres meant, there was something fundamentally wrong with this place. Something that went beyond the usual horrors of a war zone. They had been walking for about an hour when they encountered the first sign of previous military activity. It was a hastily constructed foxhole, partially collapsed and filled with stagnant water. Inside, barely visible beneath the murky liquid, were the remains of what had once been Imperial Guard equipment. Tova knelt beside the hole, using a metal rod to probe the contents. Looks like standard kit, probably from one of the earlier expeditions. Any bodies? Rhen asked. Not anymore. The implication of those words sent a chill down Rhen's spine. He was about to ask for clarification when Elric's voice crackled through the vox. Movement ahead. Multiple contacts. Approximately 200 meters. The team immediately took cover behind a massive piece of twisted metal that might once have been part of a vehicle. Peering around the edge, Rhen could see shapes moving through the fog near the base of Hab Block 7. They were too distant to make out clearly, but their movement patterns seemed wrong somehow. Too fluid, too coordinated, like a school of fish swimming through the air. Orcs, Torres whispered. Elric adjusted his scope, studying the contacts more carefully. Negative. I can't make out what they are, but they're not greenskins. As they watched, one of the shapes detached from the group and began moving in their direction. As it drew closer, Rhen felt his blood turn to ice. It was roughly humanoid in size and shape, but it moved without regard for the terrain, gliding over obstacles as if gravity were merely a suggestion. What in the Emperor's name is that thing? Torres breathed. The figure stopped suddenly, about 50 meters from their position. For a moment, it stood perfectly still, as if listening for something. Then, slowly, it turned in their direction. Even at this distance, Rhen could see the glow of its eyes. Red, like coals in a fire, burning with an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly alien. Nobody move, he whispered. Don't even breathe. The thing stared at them for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, it opened what might have been its mouth and spoke. We smell your fear, little soldiers. Sweet, sweet terror, flowing through your veins like wine. The voice was inside their heads, speaking directly to their minds rather than their ears. It carried with it images of darkness and despair, visions of what lay in store for them in the hours to come. You walk in our domain now. Your weapons cannot harm us, your armor cannot protect you. We are the hunger that devours hope, the shadow that swallows light. Elric's hand moved to his lost pistol, but Rhen caught his wrist and shook his head. Any aggressive action now would only make things worse. But perhaps, the voice continued, you would prefer to join us willingly. The transition is so much more pleasant when the subject cooperates. More shapes began to emerge from the fog, surrounding their position. Rhen counted at least a dozen, all with the same glowing red eyes and impossible fluid movement. We know you, Rhen of Cadia. We know your guilt, your pain, your desperate desire to atone for past failures. We can give you peace. We can reunite you with your sister. Rhen's grip on his lost gun tightened. The voice was trying to get inside his head to break down his mental defenses using his own memories against him. And you, Taurus of Necromunda, how long has it been since you slept without nightmares? How long since the whispers started calling your name? We can make it stop. All you have to do is listen. Taurus began to shake, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. I can't make them stop. And faithful Elric, so devoted to your corpse god. Tell us, where was the Emperor when your homeworld burned? Where was his protection when the heretics slaughtered your family? Elric's face contorted with rage and pain. The Emperor protects, he whispered, but the words sounded hollow, desperate. Tova, Tova, keeper of secrets. You carry forbidden knowledge, don't you? You've read the words of the damned, learned truths that were never meant for mortal minds. How does it feel to be corrupted, little medic? Tova clutched her kit closer, her face pale as parchment. It's not corruption. It's understanding. Yes, the voice purred with satisfaction. Understanding. The first step toward enlightenment. Rhen realized with growing horror that the entities weren't just trying to scare them. They were probing their minds, learning their weaknesses, preparing to break them down systematically. Enough, he said aloud, standing up despite the danger. We're Imperial Guardsmen. We don't negotiate with the enemies of mankind. The nearest entity tilted its head, studying him with those burning red eyes. Brave words, little soldier. But bravery will not save you here. Nothing will save you here. The Emperor protects, Elric said, standing beside Rhen. His voice was stronger now, filled with renewed conviction. Your Emperor is dead, the entity replied. Has been dead for 10,000 years. You worship a corpse and call it salvation. Then we'll die like soldiers, Rhen said. And you'll have to work for every soul you claim. The entity's laugh was like breaking glass. Oh, we will, little soldier. We will savor every moment of your despair. The shapes began to advance, moving with that same impossible fluidity. But as they drew closer, the first rays of dawn began to pierce the fog, and something remarkable happened. The entities began to fade, becoming translucent and insubstantial. The one who had been speaking let out a sound of frustration and rage. Daylight weakens us, it hissed. But night always returns. And when it does, we will be waiting. Within moments, they were gone, leaving only the echo of malevolent laughter hanging in the morning air. What just happened? Taurus asked, his voice shaking. Warp entities, Tova said quietly. They're stronger in darkness, weaker in light. But that won't protect us forever. Rhen looked toward Hab Block 7, now visible in the growing daylight. The building was a massive structure, easily 10 stories tall, with dozens of windows staring down at them like empty eye sockets. Many of the floors had been damaged by artillery fire, leaving gaping holes that revealed the darkness within. That's where we're supposed to set up our observation post? Taurus asked incredulously. Unless you want to spend the night out here in the open, Rhen replied grimly. As they approached the building, Rhen noticed more signs of previous military occupation. Defensive positions had been hastily constructed around the perimeter, but they were empty now, their occupants long since vanished. Scattered equipment littered the area, helmets, weapons, personal effects, all abandoned as if their owners had simply walked away in the middle of their duties. The entrance to the Hab block was a massive archway that had once been sealed with armored doors. Now it stood open, revealing a corridor that disappeared into absolute darkness. I really don't like this, Taurus muttered. None of us do, Rhen replied. But we have our orders. They activated their lamp packs and entered the building. The corridor was wide enough for 3 men to walk abreast, with smaller passages leading off to what had once been residential units. The walls were covered in graffiti, some of it recognizable as Imperial Guard unit markings, some of it written in languages that hurt to look at directly. As they advanced deeper into the building, Rhen became aware of a sound echoing from somewhere ahead. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew stronger as they progressed. Dripping, like water falling from a great height. They followed the sound to a central stairwell that rose through the heart of the building. Looking up, Rhen could see all the way to the top, where damaged windows allowed gray daylight to filter down through the shaft. The dripping was coming from somewhere above. "We need to reach the top floor," Rhen said. "Best vantage point for observation." 10 flights of stairs in a building that's probably structurally unsound, Torres observed. What could go wrong? They began their ascent, moving carefully on stairs that groaned and shifted under their weight. The dripping sound grew louder with each floor they climbed, and Rhen noticed that the walls here were stained with something dark and viscous. On the 5th floor, they encountered their first body. It was a guardsman, still wearing his flak armor, sitting with his back against the wall. His eyes were gone, leaving empty sockets that wept tears of blood. In his hands, he clutched a piece of paper covered in the same angular script they had seen on the trench wall. Tova knelt beside the corpse and gently took the paper from its grip. "It's a message," she said after examining it. "Written in Gothic, but the letters are wrong. Corrupted." "What does it say?" "The watchers are always watching. The listeners are always listening. The hungry are always feeding. Join us in the darkness beneath the world." Elric spat on the floor. "Heretical nonsense." "Maybe," Tova said quietly. "But it's heretical nonsense that's claiming our people one by one." They continued their climb, passing more bodies on each floor. All were Imperial Guardsmen, all had died in the same way. Eyes removed, clutching messages written in the corrupted script. By the time they reached the 10th floor, Rhen had counted 17 corpses, each one representing a squad that had attempted to establish the same observation post they were now manning. The top floor was a maze of damaged walls and collapsed ceilings, but it offered an excellent view of the surrounding landscape. Through the broken windows, they could see for kilometers in every direction, the trench lines to the south, the industrial wasteland to the east, and to the north, a series of structures that hadn't appeared on any of their maps. "Emperor's blood," Torres whispered, staring through his scope at the distant buildings. "Those aren't supposed to be there." Rhen looked where his friend was pointing and felt his heart skip a beat. Rising from the fog-like monuments to madness were a series of twisted spires, their surfaces covered in the same angular symbols they had seen throughout the Hablock. They seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light, as if illuminated from within by some unholy fire. "How is that possible?" Elric demanded. "Those structures would be visible from orbit. Command would have mentioned them in our briefing." Tova was studying the spires through her own scope, her face pale with understanding. "They're not entirely in our reality," she said quietly. "They exist partially in the warp, only becoming visible when the barrier between dimensions grows thin." "And when does that happen?" Rhen asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "At night. When fear and despair reach their peak, when the whispers grow strongest." As if summoned by her words, a faint sound began to echo through the ruined building. It was barely audible at first, but it grew steadily stronger. The whispers had found them again, even in daylight, even 10 stories above the ground. "We need to set up our equipment and establish contact with base," Rhen said, trying to ignore the voices that were beginning to call his name. "Torres, get the long-range Vox operational. Elric, establish a defensive perimeter. Tova, see what you can learn from that book of yours." As his team went to work, Rhen positioned himself at the largest window and began scanning the horizon with his scope. The view was simultaneously magnificent and terrifying, offering a perspective on the true scale of the corruption that had infected this world. The trenches to the south, which had seemed like temporary fortifications from ground level, were revealed to be part of a vast network that stretched to the horizon. They formed patterns that were almost geometric in their precision, like the components of some massive ritual circle carved into the earth itself. "Rhen," Torres called from where he was working on the Voxcaster. "I'm getting something strange on the emergency frequency." "What kind of strange?" "Voices. Lots of them. All saying the same thing." Rhen moved to where Torres was hunched over the radio equipment. Static filled the air, but underneath it, barely audible, were dozens of human voices speaking in unison. "Come home," they were saying. "Come home to the darkness. Come home to us." "Those are our missing men," Torres said, his voice hollow with realization. "They're still alive, somewhere down there, and they're calling to us." Elric looked up from where he was positioning sensor equipment near the windows. "The dead don't speak, Trooper. What you're hearing are lies meant to weaken your resolve." "But what if they're not dead?" Torres asked. "What if they've been taken somewhere, changed into something else?" Before anyone could answer, Tova's voice cut through their discussion. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, the forbidden book open in her lap, her eyes wide with terrible understanding. "I've found it," she said. "The truth about this place. About what's been happening to our people." She looked up at them, her face pale as death. "Mourntide V isn't just a battleground. It's a feeding ground. The entities we encountered this morning, the Watchers, they're not invaders from the warp. They're farmers." "Farmers," Rhen repeated. "They cultivate fear and despair like crops. The endless warfare, the impossible strategic situation, the trenches that seem to go on forever, it's all designed to create the maximum amount of psychological suffering. And when a soul has been properly prepared, they harvest it." "Harvest it for what?" "To feed something bigger. Something that's been sleeping beneath this world for millennia, waiting for enough psychic energy to wake up." The whispers were growing louder now, no longer just calling their names but speaking directly to their deepest fears and insecurities. Rhen could hear his sister's voice among them, pleading with him to join her in the darkness. "According to this book," Tova continued, her voice barely audible above the growing psychic cacophony, "the awakening process has been going on for decades. Each regiment that gets stationed here adds to the harvest, brings the sleeper closer to consciousness. Then we need to contact command," Elric said firmly. "Warn them about what's really happening here." Torres was already working on the Voxcaster, trying to establish communication with their base. But instead of the familiar voice of Sergeant Kale, what came through the speaker was something else entirely. "Hello, my brave little soldiers," the voice said, filled with mockery and malice. "How do you like our collection?" The transmission was accompanied by video feed, grainy and distorted but clearly showing the interior of Trench 77 Alpha. But instead of their fellow guardsmen, the passages were filled with the eyeless corpses they had encountered throughout the hab block, all standing at attention as if waiting for orders. "Your sergeant fought bravely," the voice continued. "He lasted almost 3 hours before his sanity finally snapped. Now he's one of us, forever and always." The camera panned to show a figure that might once have been Kale, now standing among the corpses with the same empty eye sockets and that terrible, knowing smile. "You see, the harvest has already begun. Your entire regiment is now part of our collection. Their fear and pain feeding the great work that lies ahead." Rhen felt his world crumble around him. If the base had been compromised, if their entire regiment had been taken, then they were truly alone in this nightmare. "But don't despair," the voice continued with false sympathy. "You'll be joining them soon enough. Night is coming, and in the darkness, we are so much stronger." The transmission cut out, leaving them in silence except for the whispers that continued to echo through the ruined building. "We're on our own," Torres said, stating the obvious. "No," Elric replied firmly. "We have each other, and we have our duty. The Emperor protects those who protect themselves." "The Emperor isn't here," Rhen said bitterly. "If he was, none of this would be happening." "That's exactly what they want you to think," Elric shot back. "Despair is their weapon. The moment you lose faith, you become vulnerable to their influence." As if to prove his point, the whispers suddenly focused on him, speaking in voices that sounded like his dead family members. But instead of breaking down, Elric's grip on his Aquila pendant tightened, and he began to recite the litany of faith. "The Emperor is my light in the darkness. His will is my strength. His word is my shield against the horrors of the night." The whispers recoiled from his words like vampires from holy water, growing fainter and less coherent. "It's working," Tova said with amazement. "Your faith is actually pushing them back." "Faith is a weapon," Elric replied. "The most powerful weapon we have against the forces of chaos." But even as he spoke, the daylight outside was beginning to fade. Evening was approaching, and with it, the time when the Watchers would be at their strongest. "We need to get out of here," Rhen said. "Find somewhere we can defend ourselves until dawn." "Where?" Torres asked. "The entire planet is compromised." Tova was studying her book again, flipping through pages covered in disturbing illustrations and corrupted text. "There might be a way," she said slowly, "but you're not going to like it. At this point, I'm willing to consider anything. The book mentions a ritual, a way to communicate with the entities directly, to bargain with them. Absolutely not, Elric said immediately. That way lies damnation. We're already damned, Tova replied. The question is whether we want to go quietly or fighting. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and with them the shapes were returning. Dozens of them now, surrounding the hab block, their red eyes glowing like coals in the gathering darkness. They're coming, Torres whispered, staring out the window. The whispers were growing stronger too, no longer just voices but actual physical pressure against their minds. Rhen could feel his sanity beginning to fray around the edges, his grip on reality loosening with each passing moment. The ritual, he said to Tova. Tell me about the ritual. It requires a sacrifice, she said quietly. Someone has to offer themselves willingly, to serve as a conduit between our world and theirs. No, Elric said firmly. I won't allow it. You may not have a choice, Rhen replied, looking out at the growing army of shadows that surrounded their position. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cut off from support. Unless you have a better plan, heretical rituals are starting to look pretty attractive. As if in response to his words, the entities below began to sing. It was the same corrupted lullaby he had heard in the trenches, but now it was being performed by a choir of the damned, their voices weaving together in harmonies that no human throat could produce. The sound was hypnotic, seductive, promising peace and an end to all suffering. Rhen found himself taking a step toward the window, drawn by the promise of release from the horror that had consumed his world. Don't listen, Elric grabbed his arm. It's a trap, a lie meant to break your will. But even as he spoke, Torres was moving toward the stairwell, his eyes glazed and distant. The song had found his weakness, the exhaustion and despair that had been building in him for weeks. Torres, stop, Rhen called, but his friend kept walking, drawn by voices that promised him everything he had ever wanted. Rhen tackled him just as he reached the stairs, wrestling him to the ground as Torres fought to continue his descent into darkness. Let me go, Torres pleaded. They're calling me. They need me. They want to kill you, Rhen replied, struggling to hold his friend down. No, they want to free me. Free me from the fear, from the pain, from all of it. It took both Rhen and Elric to restrain Torres as the song continued to echo through the building. But even with their friends secured, Rhen could feel the pull of the voices, the promise of peace that came with surrender. The ritual, he said to Tova. Do it now, before we all lose our minds. Tova nodded grimly and began to read from the book, her voice barely audible above the supernatural chorus that surrounded them. The words she spoke were in a language that predated human civilization, syllables that seemed to twist reality around them as they were pronounced. As she read, the air in the room began to thicken, taking on the consistency of liquid shadow. The temperature dropped rapidly and their breath began to fog in the sudden cold. And then, without warning, the singing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, more frightening than any sound could have been. In that silence, a new voice spoke, one that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. So, it said, filled with ancient amusement. The little mortals wished to bargain. A figure began to materialize in the center of the room, composed of shadow and starlight and things that existed only in nightmares. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but its edges seemed to blur and shift as if it couldn't quite decide what form it wanted to take. I am the harvester of sorrows, it said, its voice like whined through a graveyard. I am the one who tends the garden of despair that this world has become. And you, little mortals, are my finest crop. The entity that called itself the Harvester of Sorrows stood before them like a living shadow, its form constantly shifting between humanoid and something far more alien. Where its eyes should have been, galaxies of dying stars swirled in endless spirals, and when it spoke, reality itself seemed to bend around its words. You have read the forbidden texts, it said, its attention focusing on Tova with an intensity that made the air crackle with psychic energy. You understand the truth of what we are, what we do here. Most mortals die in ignorance, but you have achieved a measure of enlightenment. Tova clutched the book to her chest, her knuckles white with the effort of maintaining her composure. We know you feed on fear and despair. We know you've been using this world as a hunting ground for decades. Hunting ground? The entity's laugh was like the sound of worlds dying. Oh, little medic, you understand so little. This is not a hunting ground. This is a nursery. The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees and frost began to form on the broken windows. Outside, the shapes that surrounded the building were perfectly still, waiting for their master's command. A nursery for what? Rhen asked, though he dreaded the answer. For gods, the harvester replied simply. Beneath this world sleeps one of the great powers of the warp, a being of such immense hunger that it could devour entire star systems. But gods, even sleeping gods, require sustenance. It gestured toward the windows, and suddenly they could see beyond the physical realm into the psychic landscape that overlaid the material world. The trenches were revealed as vast feeding channels, directing streams of raw terror and anguish toward a point somewhere deep beneath the planet's surface. Every soul that dies in fear feeds the sleeper. Every mind that breaks under the strain of endless war adds to its strength. And when it finally wakes, the entity paused, savoring the moment. The galaxy itself will tremble. Elric stepped forward, his lasgun raised despite the futility of the gesture. We won't let that happen. The Emperor protects, and his will shall prevail. Your corpse, Emperor? The harvester's attention turned to the faithful guardsmen, and Elric suddenly cried out in pain, clutching his head as visions of unimaginable horror flooded his mind. Let me show you what your precious Emperor thinks of your devotion. Rhen watched in horror as his friend's faith was systematically destroyed, layer by layer, as the entity forced him to confront truths that no mortal mind was meant to comprehend. But even as Elric fell to his knees, even as tears of blood ran down his face, he continued to whisper prayers. Impressive, the harvester mused. His faith runs deeper than most. But faith without understanding is merely ignorance dressed in pretty words. Enough, Rhen said, surprising himself with the strength in his voice. You said we could bargain. What do you want? The entity's attention shifted to him, and suddenly Rhen felt as if he were being dissected by invisible scalpels. Every thought, every memory, every secret shame was laid bare before that terrible intelligence. Ah, Rhen of Cadia. The guilty one. The brother who ran when he should have stayed, who saved himself while his sister died in agony. You carry such delicious pain. Images flashed through Rhen's mind, his sister's face as the hivegangers dragged her away, her screams echoing through the narrow streets of their hablock, the moment he chose cowardice over love and fled into the night. I was just a child, he whispered. Yes, and children often make the most exquisite sufferers. Their guilt ferments over time, becoming a vintage of despair that is truly divine. The entity circled them like a predator, its form shifting and flowing with each step. But you wish to bargain. Very well. I am prepared to make you an offer. What kind of offer? Your friends may live. Tor is here, whose mind teeters on the edge of madness. Faithful Elric, whose god has abandoned him to torment. Even little Tova with her forbidden knowledge. They may all survive this night and see the dawn. And in return, you will take their place. You will become our willing servant, our herald in the material realm. You will help us prepare the galaxy for the awakening that is to come. The offer hung in the air like a physical presence, its temptation as real as gravity. Rhen could save his friends, atone for his past failures, finally find the redemption that had eluded him for so long. Don't do it, Torres said, his voice thick with exhaustion but still carrying the weight of friendship. It's not worth it, Rhen. We knew the risks when we signed up. Besides, Tova added, looking up from the book she had continued to study even during the entity's manifestation, I don't think it's telling us the complete truth. The harvester's attention snapped to her with predatory intensity. Explain. The ritual I performed wasn't just to summon you, she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. It was to bind you. To force you to answer our questions truthfully and completely. The temperature in the room plummeted and the entity's form began to writhe with rage. Clever little mortal. Too clever for your own good. The binding is already in place, Tova continued. You can't leave until we release you, and you can't lie to us while you're here. So tell us the truth. What happens to our friends if Rhen accepts your bargain? The harvester was silent for a long moment, its form struggling against invisible chains. When it finally spoke, its voice was filled with reluctant admiration. They would live, it said, but they would not remain unchanged. The corruption would spread through them slowly, over months or years, until they became willing servants of the dark. They would retain their memories, their personalities, their illusion of free will, but they would serve our cause with absolute devotion. And the sleeping god? Rhen asked. Would continue to feed and grow stronger. Your acceptance of our bargain would provide the final catalyst needed for its awakening. The galaxy would burn and you would be the one who lit the match. The truth of their situation hit Rhen like a physical blow. There was no way out, no clever solution that would save everyone. The choice was between immediate death and slow corruption, between personal damnation and galactic catastrophe. There has to be another way, he said desperately. There is, Tova said quietly. But it requires all of us to make a sacrifice. She held up the book, its corrupt pages now glowing with an inner light that hurt to look at directly. This book isn't just a record of what happened here. It's a key. A way to access the true power that lies beneath this world. You're talking about freeing the sleeping god, Elric said, his voice hoarse from his psychic ordeal but still carrying the weight of absolute certainty. That's madness. No, Tova replied. I'm talking about destroying it. The harvester hissed, its form becoming more solid and threatening. Impossible. The sleeper is beyond mortal reach, protected by layers of reality that your kind cannot even perceive. But not beyond the reach of the warp itself, Tova said. The book contains a ritual of unbinding, a way to sever the connections that anchor the entity to this reality. But it requires the willing sacrifice of souls that have been touched by the corruption. Us, Rhen said, understanding dawning. All of us. Our fear, our despair, our pain, we can turn it into a weapon. Use the very emotions that have been feeding the sleeper to destroy it instead. Torres looked up from where he had been sitting in exhausted silence. You're talking about suicide. I'm talking about victory, Tova replied. A way to ensure that this nightmare ends with us, that no other regiment will be sent here to feed this thing. The harvester was straining against its invisible bonds now, its form becoming more solid and threatening with each passing second. The binding will not hold much longer, it warned. And when I am free, your suffering will be exquisite. Then we'd better decide quickly, Rhen said. He looked around at his friends, these people who had become closer to him than family during their time in the trenches. Torres, whose loyalty had never wavered despite his growing madness. Elric, whose faith had sustained them all even in the face of cosmic horror. Tova, whose courage had given them this final chance at redemption. I vote for the ritual, he said quietly. Agreed, Tova said immediately. Elric was quiet for a long moment, his hand moving to the Aquila pendant at his throat. The Emperor protects, he said finally. But sometimes, he requires us to make the ultimate sacrifice to serve his will. I'm with you. All eyes turned to Torres, who was staring out the window at the shapes that waited in the darkness. You know what the funny thing is? He said. I'm not scared anymore. For the first time in weeks, the whispers have stopped, and I can think clearly. He looked back at his friends with a smile that was both sad and strangely peaceful. Let's do this. The harvester let out a sound that was part scream, part roar of rage. You cannot. I forbid it. Your permission, Tova said, opening the book to its final pages, was never required. She began to read the ritual of unbinding, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. The language was the same corrupt tongue she had used to summon the harvester, but now the words carried a different power, a sense of finality that made the air itself tremble. As she read, the others joined hands around her, forming a circle of brotherhood that had been forged in the fires of shared terror and tempered by the decision to face damnation for the greater good. The room began to shake, reality itself protesting against what they were attempting. Cracks appeared in the walls, spreading outward like spider webs, and through those cracks, they could see the true nature of the world beneath. A pulsing, organic landscape of flesh and bone and screaming faces. The harvester was fading now, its form becoming less distinct as the binding that held it began to unravel. But even as it lost cohesion, its voice continued to echo through the room. Fools! You understand nothing. The sleeper is beyond your reach, beyond any mortal agency. You will die for nothing. But Tova's voice was stronger, more real, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. As she spoke the final words of the ritual, the building around them began to collapse, not downward but inward, folding in on itself as the barriers between dimensions broke down. The last thing Rhen saw before the darkness claimed him was the face of his sister, smiling at him with forgiveness and pride. The last thing he heard was the harvester's scream of rage and disbelief as the sleeping god beneath the world convulsed once and was still forever. And then there was light. The search and rescue team from the 47th Cadian shock troops found the ruins of Hablok 7 3 days after the seismic event that had shaken the entire continent. The building had collapsed completely, leaving only a crater filled with twisted metal and rubble. But strangest of all, The perpetual fog that had shrouded the area for decades was gone, replaced by clear skies and gentle sunlight. Captain Marcus Voss led the team personally, his scarred face grim with the expectation of finding nothing but corpses. The entire regiment that had been stationed in this sector had gone silent 18 hours ago. Their last transmission a garbled report about hostile contact and requesting immediate extraction. "Any sign of survivors?" he called to his men as they carefully picked their way through the debris. "Negative, sir," Sergeant Kane replied, "but we're reading some strange energy signatures from the center of the crater." They worked their way toward the source of the readings, using portable scanners to guide them through the maze of collapsed masonry and twisted steel. What they found there defied explanation. For bodies, arranged in a perfect circle, their hands clasped together even in death, they were intact, unmarked by the violence that had destroyed the building around them, their faces peaceful in a way that spoke of sacrifice willingly made. "Imperial Guard," Voss observed, noting the familiar uniforms and equipment. "Must be the observation team that was sent up here." But even as he spoke, he noticed something else. The ground beneath the bodies was different, cleaner somehow, as if whatever corruption had infected this place had been burned away by their sacrifice. "Sir," one of his men called from the edge of the crater, "you need to see this." Voss made his way over to where Trooper Collins was standing, his Auspex scanner beeping frantically in his hands. "What is it?" "The psychic readings, sir. They're gone. Completely gone. This whole area used to register as a Class 5 warp anomaly, but now," he gestured helplessly at his equipment, "it's cleaner than a consecrated shrine." Voss looked back at the 4 bodies in the center of the crater. Whatever had happened here, whatever these soldiers had done, it had cost them their lives but saved countless others. "Get a recovery team up here," he ordered. "These men deserve a proper burial." As his team worked to prepare the bodies for transport, Voss noticed something clutched in the hands of the woman who appeared to be the medic. It was a book, its pages blackened and brittle as if they had been touched by fire. He started to reach for it, then stopped. Some things were better left alone. 3 months later, a monument was erected on the site where Hablock 7 had once stood. It was a simple thing, just 4 names carved in blessed stone. Trooper Rhen Calvis, Trooper Torres Valdez, Guardsman Elric Thorne, and Medic Tova Kane. Below their names, a single inscription. They stood against the darkness, and the darkness could not overcome them. The planet that had once been known as Mourntide V was renamed Haven's Rest, and it became a place of pilgrimage for Imperial Guard regiments throughout the sector. Soldiers would come to stand before the monument and remember that sometimes, victory required the ultimate sacrifice. But perhaps most importantly, the whispers that had haunted the world for so long were finally, blessedly silent. In the end, for soldiers had faced the abyss and chosen to sacrifice themselves rather than allow it to consume the galaxy. They had died as they had lived, as brothers and sisters in arms, united against the darkness that threatened all humanity. And somewhere in the Emperor's light, their souls finally found the peace that had eluded them in life. The nightmare was over, forever. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But sometimes, in the darkest hour, heroes rise to remind us that even in a galaxy consumed by endless conflict, the human spirit endures. This is their story. This is their sacrifice. This is their victory.